Hi, welcome to MMT Mondays on Real Progressives. I'm your host, Jeff Ginter. So tonight, I'm really excited about this one. I love this one. This is the Gower Initiative for Modern Money Studies, the GIMS. I love this organization. They work tirelessly along with Modern Money Network and Real Progressives, New Economic Perspectives. I could literally just sit here and list all the different organizations. It's wonderful. They're based over in England, and they invited over Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, and Martin Watts to give presentations. I'm really excited about this one, but it is a little bit long, so I am splitting this one up into two parts because with the Q&A afterwards, it actually got to be like an hour and a half, in length. So tonight we're presenting Warren Mosler and Bill Mitchell, and then next week we'll continue with Martin Watts and the Q&A. I'll be back at the end. Enjoy.
So, Warren, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and wonderful to see all of you out here. And I want to congratulate all the organizers on doing what they've done. And I'd go on and on about it, but I've got 30 minutes, so can't. They didn't give me time for that. I also saw on the title that it said this was going to be about the MMT white paper, which it is, but I didn't say that specifically. So there is an MMT white paper that I put out, and I'll just start with the beginning, which is the most important part. MMT alone recognizes that the U.S. government and its agents are the only supplier of that which it demands for payment of taxes. Okay, so all the money to pay taxes comes from the government, or else it's what's called counterfeit. The government or its agents. Commercial banks are agents of the government. There we go. And that means things like crowding out private spending or private borrowing, driving up interest rates, federal funding requirements, solvency issues are not applicable for a government that spends first and then collects its own tickets later. Okay, so this is be forward and backwards. Okay. So what we can't answer is the most important thing, which is your starting point, which is what do you want? What does a country want, the UK, the United States? And I just have a list of things that are generally assumed that the nation wants. Okay, but I was just talking to a gentleman here who's looking at Cuba, and you can't make those assumptions necessarily that that's what the Cuban government wants. It might, but you can't. So from what MMT is, it's a description of monetary operations, and it can also give you insight on how to get the results that you want from your policy, your inputs. Okay, so. And at the bottom, if the real resources are already there, it can happen. Now I begin with this little story of Pompeii. My wife and I were visiting Pompeii about 4 years ago, and we were on a guided tour, and we were somewhere around there, and the guide showed us these coins that they found in the streets, or what would have been in somebody's pocket, or a merchant's place of business. And he said it was a very nice place to live. They had very nice public services. What they did was they'd hire people for public safety and public sanitation and the aqueducts or whatever, and they would pay them, excuse me, they would collect taxes from everybody, okay, these coins, and then they would hire people to do all the public service, and then they would pay the people. And even though there were high taxes, people liked to live there. And I said to him, being a little bit of a troublemaker, I said, look, the way it worked was that they would pay the people first and then collect the tax. Okay, this is a core MMT principle, right? And he goes, no, you collect the tax and then you pay the people. So I said, well, where did the coins come from? He says, well, the government made them. So I go, well, how did anybody get a coin to pay the tax? He says, so you pay them first and then collect it? And I go, yeah, how else can it work? And he goes, no. Walks away. Okay, I'll guarantee you everybody in Pompeii knew that the government would spend first and then collect the coins later. oh, I got a preview of the next slide here. Interesting. This technology is overrunning me. Okay, so the fundamentals are, and these are outlined in the white paper, the funds to pay taxes and buy bonds come only from the state. I've already said this 4 times. Okay, if you don't take anything else home, they're spending first. Okay, well, where's the money going to come from for this? They're spending it first. The question is, where are the taxpayers going to get the money to be able to meet their tax liability? Not where's the government going to get the money? Okay. Therefore, the state from inception spends or lends first, and then taxes can be paid. To repeat one more time. Therefore, state spending is not constrained by revenues. Right? I mean, does anybody think that the movie theater collects the ticket first and then sells it? No. Okay, you sell the ticket first, and then you collect it. Okay. The money story has to begin somewhere. And for purposes of understanding today's currency, we start with the state that desires to provision itself. You'll hear other people start money stories, textbooks about people living on an island, bartering, and then they start coming up with a coin. And maybe they did. I don't know. I wasn't there. But that is not illustrative of how things happen today. To start today's money story, you start with a state desiring to provision itself. Right? And what the state needs is soldiers for defense, it needs public health, it needs public education, it needs a legal system. How do you get people out of the private sector, out of whatever they were doing, into the public sector? Pompeii needed people to do all this work. How do you get people off the street to do the public service? Okay, and so the first step is to impose a tax liability payable in the currency, in the state's currency, which becomes the tax credit. The currency is the thing needed to pay taxes. That's what a tax credit is. Okay, so you impose a tax liability in dollars. You impose a tax liability in pound sterling. What have you just done? Okay, you've changed things. Pompeii imposed a tax liability in their coins. Everybody's had to pay so many coins a month, or else they're going to lose their house. They're going to go up for public auction. They have suddenly created people looking for work that's paid in that coin. Before that tax liability, nobody cared about the coin. They didn't even know there was one. But after this tax liability, suddenly you're aware that you've got an obligation. And it doesn't have to be everybody. It only has to be a few people. But you've got this, absolute obligation to pay this thing, and it's coercive. They're going to sell your house if you don't pay it. Right? What we have created is sellers of services, goods and services, looking for paid work. That's called unemployment. So when the state imposes a tax liability, the purpose by design of that thing is to create unemployment, people looking for paid work, for the further purpose of being able to hire them. Okay, so you have a tax liability, results in sellers of goods and services, which is unemployment, okay, seeking the state's currency. The state then can make its purchases in its otherwise worthless currency. There's no value to these things apart from that. Okay. Taxes are paid now, okay? People come to work, you pay them. Now the economy has the money to pay the tax and buy bonds if the state happens to be selling bonds. Now in Pompeii, they didn't sell bonds. Okay, what happened was they found something like 20,000 coins in the street. How did they get there? Okay, what happens to state spending? After the state spends, the private sector has only 2 choices as a whole. Use the money to pay taxes, in which case it's removed from the economy, or don't use the money to pay taxes, maybe buy something from somebody else, leave it in your pocket, okay? In which case it remains in the economy until someone uses it to pay taxes. So Pompeii had all these people show up for work, for public service. They paid them all. Turns out they paid them more than was enough to pay their tax bill. People were willing to earn more coins overall than the tax bill. Like, why would they do that? Well, they wanted coins in their pockets. The merchants wanted to be able to transact and make change. Who knows? But they did. And we know they did because we found 20,000 coins in the street. And the only way they could have gotten there is if the state, the city, had spent more than it collected. Simple point of logic. Okay? Those coins in the street are the public debt. They spent more than they collected. That's the public debt. Okay? Today, the UK spends a certain amount, let's say 100, maybe 90 are paid in taxes, and the other 10 remain in the street. It's a public debt. Okay? They're liabilities of the state. The state owes you the right to keep your house if you pay those things in taxes, right? That's why accountants call them liabilities. They have an obligation to you to accept these to release you from your tax penalty, whatever the penalty for non-payment is. Right? So Pompey did not then sell bonds to give these people with 20,000 coins a place to invest. It never occurred to them to do that. Why would they? Okay, the UK does, the US does, Japan does. We don't have to ask why they do. But it's left over from at best, you can say it's left over from the gold standard, but it's another story. But today, it's not an applicable thing to do, and we'll get into that later. Okay, so what is the public debt? The public debt is the funds spent by the state that have not yet been used to pay taxes. Okay, it constitutes what can be best thought of as a net money supply in the economy. All those coins in the street were the money supply in Pompeii. Okay, the 22 trillion of public debt in the U.S. is the money in the street in the U.S. The U.S. spent 22 trillion more than came back and that was paid in taxes. It's kept. What is the street? What do we mean by kept on the street today? What we mean is it's kept in bank accounts. Some in cash, but mostly in bank accounts. Which bank accounts specifically do we mean? We mean bank accounts at the central bank. What are those bank accounts called? They're called reserves and treasury securities, gilts, U.S. Treasury bonds. Those are just bank accounts at the central bank. You give them money, you get it back with interest. It's a central bank. The money is in a bank account. Okay, so we don't keep it out on the street. We keep it in bank accounts. But it's the same thing. Okay, and okay, so a growing economy has a growing money supply. Does that surprise anybody? Okay. Move on to unemployment. Another MMT fundamental insight, although others have talked about it, but not recently. But taxation by design causes unemployment. We've already reviewed that. It was a tax that caused people to seek paid work to get that currency. Unemployment, therefore, what is that? People looking for work who can't find a job. Okay, that's the evidence that the state has not spent enough to cover the need to pay taxes. They create a tax liability. It creates a certain need to pay taxes. It also creates a desire to save. Once you know this is the money the state wants for taxes, you want to save a few. So the tax creates two things, a need to pay the tax and a desire to save. Okay? It hasn't spent enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the desire to save. Another way to say the same thing, if the state doesn't spend enough to cover the need to pay taxes and the desire to save, the evidence is unemployment. As Bill will talk later, unemployment is caused by the state. Okay, it's deliberate policy, whether they know it or not. They've done it. It wouldn't be there if not for what they've done. It's not something that happens in nature that we're trying to reverse the natural order of things. This is something that's created by a simple monetary system. So how do you reverse the unemployment? Because it's a mistake. If the U.S. government knew it only was going to hire 5 million people, why would it impose a tax that creates 10 million unemployed? That doesn't make any sense. If Pompey had too many people coming to work after they put the tax on, they didn't need all these people, what would they do? Okay, there's two things you can do. You can hire them. They can always do that. You're not going to run out of money. They had a big coin box to pay these people. The United States just credits your account. The UK just credits your account. So all these extra unemployed you created, you could hire them, have second thoughts and say, you know what, there is a lot more we'd like the public sector to do. We need more public services. Or you can lower the tax, in which case they'll go away. Because the only reason they're there is because the need to pay tax and the desire to save. Okay? So the state has those two options. But there's one more problem. Once you've created unemployment and you've hired the ones you want and you haven't hired the rest, you've damaged those people. They can't just go back and get another job. And studies have shown that employers strongly prefer to hire somebody already working. They don't like to hire people who've been unemployed. There's too much risk. You don't know if they're going to be on time every day, or if they're going to get in fights, or they're on drugs, or you just don't know. And so you don't know if they get along with other people, or their work ethics. So you're willing to train them if they're good, and you're willing to bring them on, but you don't want to take a chance having somebody who's just out. So you'd rather hire somebody already working, even if you have to pay a little extra. And this has been demonstrated over and over again. And so, yes, we can lower the tax and have fiscal expansion to try and get business good, and so hopefully these employers will hire the unemployed, but they don't. And especially in Europe, you get very high what they call hysteresis, where every cycle the amount of unemployed that can't get jobs goes up and up because they're damaged goods economically. All right, and so what do we do about that? How do I say it here? Okay. What we do is offer a job to anybody willing and able to work, okay, that has a certain JG wage, which is a reasonable wage, and that, by the way, becomes the minimum wage in the economy. So it establishes, because nobody could pay less than that because people will take this job. So it does it automatically. You don't have to have minimum wage legislation with investigators and all that. So we offer a job to anybody willing and able to work, and now they're employed. Now, we've done this to promote the transition from unemployment, which is public sector. The government's taking you out of the private sector with its taxation, from unemployment back to private sector employment. Okay, so first, of course, the public sector properly provisions itself. It's got all these unemployed, hire whatever you need to get the public services you want. But if there's anybody left over, you don't want to be doing nothing. You want to transition them back into the private sector. Okay, now, there may be some people, even with a government job, don't want to go back to the private sector. Fine, no problem there. And, some people will say, well, then it's not a transition job. Well, it is. They're available for work. They're earning a wage. If the private sector can't attract them at a higher wage, the private sector is going to have to try harder because they like what they're doing and they want to do it. I don't have any problem with that. But still, the purpose of this program is to provide for the transition into the private sector. Okay? And again, it's after properly provisioning the public sector. Okay? And so what we have here is critical to a lot of people who might not agree with a lot of other things. The job guarantee provides a superior price anchor versus unemployment. The reason we have the unemployed today is they're used to keep inflation down. You get a lot of unemployment, you conduct policy to make unemployment go up because you're worried about inflation and you think that'll bring inflation down. They're competing with other workers, they keep wages from going up, and demand goes down because they're making less money, and so we use unemployment to help keep prices from going up. But how effective are they in preventing wages from going up too much, whatever that means? Okay, if the people can't be hired, if the government doesn't want to hire them. Okay, it's like having, and Bill might talk later about a buffer stock of wool, which is where he started. And you've been buying wool because the price goes down. Then when the price goes up, you go to sell it out in the market, but it's all rotted. Okay, it's not going to work and that's what happens with unemployment. But when people are working, now you've kept your wool in tip-top condition, you've kept the butter fresh, whatever your buffer stock is, you've kept your labor ready for work, and now it's an effective price anchor. And that's the paper I wrote that was published in a leading mainstream journal about how this employed buffer stock is a superior price anchor than unemployment, and therefore the European Central Bank should fund it to meet their inflation targets. Okay, so very important to know these aspects of the job guarantee. These are the core monetary aspects. Okay, so what would our proposals today, or my proposals today? It's all, proposals are always personal, of course. How do we do it here? Number one, I would increase the annual deficit by 5% of GDP as a starting point. I think there's at least 5% slack in the economy, probably 10 or 15. 5% is a good starting point. Once you see it's working, then you can go on from there and fill it up. So that would either be a tax cut, so people would have more money to spend if you wanted more private sector GDP, maybe eliminate value-added tax or something like that. And then, or you could increase public services, properly fund national health, rails, whatever else you wanted, research, you name it, infrastructure. Those are political choices. You're going to have left and right discussing those, but coming up with something that adds up to 5% of GDP. Use fiscal policy then to sustain full employment. By full employment, we're going to have a job guarantee, which is a form of full employment. It's not necessarily everybody's definition of it, but what you've done is offered a job to anybody looking for work. And once that's happened, you can say that's a form of full employment. But then that size of the JG pool, to get them to transition, you have to have an economy that wants to hire them. You then have to either lower taxes or increase public spending to make sure that number is kept to a minimum. And that minimum should be a lot less than today's unemployment, because it's a better buffer stock. So if the minimum unemployment, not that there is one, because I can argue that there is no such thing, but is 5%, maybe this gets you down to 2%, or some frictional level where people are going to be unemployed as they're changing jobs and that type of thing. Okay. Sustain a permanent zero interest rate policy. You look at all the coins in the street of Pompeii, they didn't earn interest. It was a zero interest rate policy. There was no inflation because of that or anything else. Japan's had a zero interest rate policy for 30 years, with only a brief period of maybe 0.25%. They're still fighting deflation. The European Union, European central banks got negative rates. They're not causing any inflation. It doesn't work that way. So you don't do that. And once you have a zero rate policy, then there's no interest paid on government bonds. So, which, while it can be used as a policy tool, which I won't discuss now, what government interest payments I call basic income for people who already have money. When the government raises rates, they're paying out more interest to people who already have money in the form of government bonds, and it pushes up the whole interest rate spectrum, which is for people who already have money. To me, that doesn't suit me politically as a way to spend money into the economy by just giving more money to people who already have a lot of money. But that's just me. Okay. Adequately fund public services, investment, and research. I'm going to do a quick word on where the price level comes from and where inflation comes from, and why with a zero interest rate policy you still don't get inflation in Japan. What was a coin worth in Pompeii? Well, it depends on what you have to do to get it from the issuer. It's a monopoly. Monopolists set price. So if the government of Pompeii, the state, said we're going to pay 1 coin a day, what's that coin worth? It's worth whatever 1 day's labor is worth to everybody. When I mean what's it worth? What's it worth in the marketplace? Would you rather be a police officer for a day, or would you rather grow tomatoes and raise chickens and sell them to police officers? You know, there's some relative value that goes on there. So let's say a coin was worth 1 day's labor, and that was worth 10 tomatoes in the marketplace. All right. That ratio doesn't change unless the government changes what it pays to the police officers and the sanitation workers. As long as it's paying one, those things will be worth a day's labor forever. It's not going to change. Nobody has any say in that. The monopolist sets the price. What if the government says, oh, we're going to give everybody a raise, we're going to pay 2 coins a day? Well, fine. Now a coin's only worth half a day's labor. Now it's only worth 5 tomatoes. All they've done is cut the value of the money in half. They used to call that crying down the currency, okay? That's all they did was cut it in half. The currency is worth what you have to get it from the issuer. It's got nothing to do with inflation expectations and rates and demand and all that. It's what you have to do to get it. They've got it, and you need it, or you're going to lose your house. Here's what it's worth. And then in a market economy, at least in theory, you only have to set one price, and the rest is reflected as relative value in the marketplace, what it's worth versus other things. And that'll change with scarcity and all kinds of other things. And there's all kinds of institutional structure out there that'll cause that to change laws on what you can do. But generally, that's a good guideline as what it'll be worth. Okay. Bank of England, process payments, 0% rate, provide unlimited bank deposit insurance. Shouldn't be limited to £80,000. It's not a single good reason I've ever heard for that. Okay, it just causes more expense for the banks as they got to go out with all this effort to do things. But if you have the next one, provide unlimited bank liquidity. through the Bank of England, then you certainly don't have to worry about any problems from unlimited deposit insurance. But then once the banks have unlimited ability to fund themselves, you've got to regulate and supervise the asset side, what they can do for lending. And I have a very narrow banking proposal as what they can actually do with the when they make loans. Okay, so once you've guaranteed the deposits, which is already the case, now the banks have public money, it's state funds, and if you don't regulate them properly, you get all kinds of moral hazard, as we've seen in the past. And if you say you can't, you don't have enough regulators, then you can't let them do it. You have to just eliminate all lending facilities until you're in a position to adequately supervise them and regulate them. Otherwise, it's like giving the military guns and bullets, but we haven't established the officers and the rules for the military. You can't do that. You can't have these people running around, fully armed without rules. Okay. And the monetary policy that would follow this is government spending remains in member bank and BOE accounts, so there's no government securities, which is pretty much how the U.S. and Japan has done that almost entirely. It doesn't create any problems. It just makes things easier, cuts down on expenses. It's just more efficient. And the Bank of England should fund the job guarantee and supervise it because it's an anti-inflation tool. And they've got plenty of people working there now who are going to have a lot less to do. This will give them something a lot more important to do. Uh-oh, is there anybody here from the bank? Okay. Because if there was, I'd have to dumb this down a lot more for you. Okay. Fiscal policy, simple. You target output and employment goals. The deficits are residual. You don't even have to publish a number. Nobody should care. Nobody will care. Okay. With a permanent zero rate policy, there's no interest payments. You don't need to know what the public debt is. It doesn't enter into any calculation. It's just a residual calculation to make sure you didn't make a mistake with the arithmetic. Trade. This will be the last part. Okay. Exports are real cost, things you send out. Imports are the benefits, the things you get in. Think of your real wealth as your pile of stuff. The pile is this big from everything you produce domestically. It gets this big when you import. And it goes down when you export. Okay, so the imports are the benefits, the exports the cost. And what's left over is your real wealth. So you want to optimize that. Okay, when somebody's army conquers another country, the loser has to send things to the winner. Okay, the winner doesn't say, oh, we want to be an export power. We're going to conquer somebody and export to them, and so we're the winners. That doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, and so, lost my train of thought. Okay, and so the other question that comes up is they wonder, like, what if nobody trades with us because if we do this, we have export, what if we import too much or whatever, have an export surplus? And that's total nonsense. Okay, what does the UK produce nowadays? Is there some product here I'm trying to come up with? Something, right? What's that?
Aggregates.
Aggregates? Materials.
Yeah.
Okay, so you take a barge full of aggregates, right? I've got one of those back home, by the way. Okay, and you send it over to, to Rome or something. Okay, and then it exchanges for so many Ferraris, right? And there's a market, a world market for that. So many lira, so many euros for this, so many liras for that, and you'll get this barge will trade for 10 Ferraris or whatever. Or are they going to say, well, because England's unemployment, the UK's unemployment is too low, and because the currency went down, we're not going to do that. Of course, they don't care. They don't care if you even have a currency, right? Those aggregates will exchange for those Ferraris at some ratio, totally independent of anything going on domestically. Right? So when we look at your pile of stuff, the exports go out and the imports come in. That's not going to change. Now, if they've been sending you extra cars because they want to hold your currency, that part could change. It's not particularly large. That could change. And that's what we talk about is optimizing your real terms of trade. You want to be able to get the most for what you send out. But what happens is it creates things that happen in the currency create these massive distributional problems. If the currency goes down or the currency goes up, that affects who has to dig the aggregates and who gets to drive the Ferraris, okay, back in England. Okay, but it doesn't affect the total for the country. And those distributional issues are best dealt with local policy, fiscal policy, and all your rules and regulations and everything else, and not by making your pile of stuff smaller. You don't go into an austerity program to bring down the real wealth so that you can alter distribution or alter something like that. It doesn't make any sense to do that. Okay, so your real wealth is everything produced domestically plus imports minus exports. Full employment optimizes real terms of trade and optimizes wealth. So it's critical to keep full employment. The gains you're going to have from full employment will be much larger than any small change that might happen in trade. But again, you've got to mind the distributional issues. Okay, so just a quick review. Government's public infrastructure for public purpose. These are the things we've gone through. The most important one right now is last, job guarantee for anyone willing to work. And I'll leave it to Martin and Bill to fill in any holes I've left. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so this, this thing MMT began in around the early 90s. And the sort of partnership when Warren and I met up was about 94, I think. And in different ways, we'd been cooking up stuff. And then when we met, the project really began. Warren had done prior work on the monetary side and the banking side. I'd done prior work on other aspects of it, the buffer stock aspects. And my neck's going to go crazy. And that's when the MMT project began. And we used to laugh when we'd meet up that we could count the MMTers on one hand with spare fingers. And it was 2, 3. And Warren recruited some people and it started from there and spilled over to 2 hands. And we were really engaged. Warren was engaged in financial markets and he'd have these annual events where we'd sort of talk to financial market people. And obviously I and Randy were engaged in the academic side. And you know, we were building what I now call a body of work, the principles, and Warren's given a really good introduction to those. And then I remember one day we had a meeting, Randy and Warren and I were there, and I'd just been to an IT seminar because I really like coding and that sort of stuff, and I'd been to an IT seminar announcing the concept of a blog, a weblog, and I announced to Randy and Warren, can you remember that, Warren? Yeah. I said, I'm going to start a blog. And I remember Randy was quite impolite. And by the way, I just love England. I was out running this morning. Come on. I was out running this morning. Polite got me going. And I was up near St Anne's, and there's this sign on the beach, and it says, no barbecues or open flames on the grass area, but it says it's a polite notice. You wouldn't find that in Australia, I can tell you. I just love that, polite notice. Anyway, the move into social media was a very important move, I think, because that started the communication with grassroots people. Because if you've studied philosophy of science, you'll know that trying to get paradigm change in the knowledge communities is very difficult. And trying to deal with my peers in the academic sphere is as I'll explain in a moment, is just riddled with what I call groupthink. And so really MMT's, I think, the first type of, we're in the middle of a paradigm shift, folks. And I think that we've, in terms of the history of economic thought, this is the first paradigm shift that's going to be accomplished by grassroots action. And that's a really significant event, and you're going to be all part of it. And when the historical line is drawn, you're going to be on the right side, unless there's some closets in the room. All right, so that's sort of a bit of an introduction. Check out some of these headlines. Now, this was in Bloomberg, this was in some other, Krugman, Summers, Rogoff, all of the sort of heavy hitters in the mainstream economics in the recent period have really come out and are trying to kill us off. This particular quote here is not a quote. It's wording from a bill that's before the US Senate, where 5 Republican senators have actually proposed a bill which seeks to condemn us because we're a danger to the economy of the United States. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're making progress. But
I know Larry Fink, so I think he did it just to give me a little shot.
Yeah. I mean, I love the one that it's grotesque. I've always fancied I was okay. Okay, so what we're dealing with basically is a resistance. This is all the resistance that's now coming. And paradigm shifts go through stages. And we were ignored for about 20 years while we were cooking up the body of work. And now we're into the stage where we're clearly a threat to the mainstream. More and more people are starting to talk about it. It's infiltrated the political sphere now, and there's champions emerging for these ideas in the political sphere. And once that happens, then there's going to be votes cast for politicians and so on and so forth. And what we're seeing is a mainstream of my profession, which is has a disgraceful history, and a history where they've been blithely unaware of reality for years. And that's what happens in dominant paradigms. And I'm not going to go through all of these things, but these are elements of this blindness. In 2003, a Nobel Prize winner, Robert Lucas Jr., announced to all of us that the business cycle was dead. That we were no longer going to have any more cycles of recession and boom, and that all that government should do was then concentrating on further the microeconomic aspects of life, further deregulation, further movements towards lacking job protections, scrap. Some of the senators that have put that bill before the US Congress want to scrap the EPA, they want to scrap the Inland Revenue Service, they want to scrap the Department of Education, and this is the sort of thing that my profession has been providing authority to, these mad, crazy politicians. And essentially my profession became locked in this bubble, self-reverential bubble, where there is no longer going to be any cycles, where all the main macroeconomic problems had been solved, and where you didn't even have to worry about financial markets. So the dominant framework for macroeconomics is taught in our universities, and which is dominating in central banks and treasury and finance departments, the so-called new Keynesian paradigm, didn't even have a banking or financial sector in its model, which is used for policy analysis. So it wasn't, and that's because they believed in efficient market theory, where whatever the financial markets would do would be optimal. And so it's no surprise they didn't see the GFC coming, because they didn't even have a financial sector. They didn't think it was important. And this just on groupthink. What we're now in the phase of is seeing what Imre Lakatos, who was a famous philosopher of science at LSE, called a degenerative paradigm. And that's a paradigm that's basically lost the plot, but it persists as the dominant paradigm in the area of concern through groupthink. Groupthink's a way in which behaviour of groups it becomes patterned, and it has features. This was identified in the social psychology literature in the early 60s, this sort of patterned behaviour. And a sort of mob rule develops where it filters out dissent through various ways, graduate programs. I was telling Warren yesterday that when I was doing my master's work before PhD, a senior professor, Parrish, Warren, Martin taught me in that program, by the way. But a senior professor at the university said to me that he said, "I'd advise you to become a sociologist because you're never going to cut it as an economist." And that was a filtering out pressure. And they do it through publications and through grant distribution, through appointments and all the rest of it. And so very few people that have non-mainstream positions come through. Very few of us. And they just deny anything that creates dissonance for them. And so these quotes I had up there are them trying to maintain their degenerative paradigm that's lost its empirical content. That's the jargon. What that means is that it can't provide any insights into what the real world is. And there's a whole lot of basic myths that are taught to students and policymakers rehearse regularly. Government's like a household. Printing money is inflationary. And all these articles that those headlines came from rehearse these myths. That deficits crowd out, fiscal deficits crowd out private initiatives. That you define what's fiscally sustainable by some number of a fiscal deficit. Now, what the next part of this talk is really to provide some more insight into the basic principles that Warren initiated. The mainstream approach is to define fiscal sustainability and fiscal space in terms of a set of financial ratios. Now, that's exemplified here, for example, in the British Labour Party's fiscal credibility rule. Just the terminology gives it away. And in the Eurozone, 3% maximum fiscal deficit and a 60% maximum public debt ratio, as if those have any meaning. Whereas with our approach to macroeconomics, the MMT approach, fiscal sustainability can't be defined in those terms. They have no context and no meaning. And so whenever we're thinking about fiscal sustainability, we have to be considering, well, what's the role of fiscal policy? And that was Warren's first slide. What are the aims of society? Now, MMT can't give you those aims because those aims reflect the collective values of the society. And so a brutal dictatorship running a monetary system will have different aims to a very progressive left society. But you've got to start off with your aims, and fiscal policy isn't there to produce a surplus or a deficit. It's there to achieve, to use the capacity of the currency issuer to move the society through output and service provision to those aims. And so if you've got a society where you've got a private domestic sector, households and firms who want to save overall for a rainy day, and you've got a society that's benefiting from having an external deficit. I repeat that, benefiting from running an external deficit. That follows on from Warren's pile of stuff. And what Warren didn't say is that what the macro of an external deficit means some of the income that's being produced in a period is going to be leaking out of the economy. In return, you're getting this stuff through imports being higher than exports. And if you've got some of the income that's being generated domestically not being recycled back into spending in the next period because the households and firms are desiring to save overall, then you've got a basic macro problem, because if nothing else happens, you'll end up with recession. Because income is being produced by firms on the expectation that they'll be able to sell the stuff. And so if they produce the income one period and it doesn't all come back next period in spending, they'll realise they've made a mistake and they cut back. And so the only way you can get out of that bind, there's only one other sector left, and that's the government sector. And that establishes why typically you'll be running continuous deficits to maintain stable growth and full employment. Typically, when a government runs fiscal surpluses, a recession soon follows. Now, there's some countries that can run fiscal surpluses and satisfy the domestic need to save overall. And that's countries like Norway that have got very strong export revenue coming in. But they're in the minority, extreme minority. So when we talk about fiscal sustainability, the first question you've got to ask yourself is, what do we want to achieve with fiscal policy? And we want to maintain high levels of activity so that nobody becomes unemployed. And that's just a different way of saying what Warren said anyway. Another thing that we need to focus on is this concept of depoliticisation. And I'm not going to go into each of these, but the tendency over the last several decades has been for those in charge of fiscal policy, that is the currency issuing government, to become obsessed with running contractionary fiscal positions and realising that in our democracies that's unpopular because it causes unemployment, it causes loss of services. Tomorrow I'm giving a talk to local government officials in London about the disastrous situation that austerity has caused local councils, and it's the perfect example here. That what depoliticisation has done under this austerity mindset is that the decision maker pushes the responsibility and the identification of the costs onto an external entity. So in Britain, for example, the local government officials are getting pilloried because libraries are closing and essential programs are being shut down because of the loss of income. But the actual cause is central government. And, you know, Britain is the perfect example of this as well, because of, if those old enough to remember, the mid-70s, when a Labor Chancellor, Dennis Healey, told lies to the British people that the government was just about to run out of money and would have to borrow from the IMF. That was depoliticisation. What he wanted to do, he'd become infested with monetarism. What he wanted to do was impose austerity. He knew it wouldn't be the unions, the wage agreement at the time. He knew that wasn't going to be popular, so he had to invent a story that, we've got no choice. That was the beginning of Tina. Margaret Thatcher didn't invent Tina. Dennis Healey and James Callaghan did.
We lived through it.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't. What's that? Now, another thing that we need to get very clear also, and this is both those quotes I showed at the beginning of the critics, but also progressive people who are trying to make sense of our work. I often hear, well, when we have progressives put on Twitter and stuff, well, when we have MMT, things are going to be great. Or Larry Summers says, when we have MMT, if we dare step in and have MMT, it's going to be grotesque and the world will melt. It's as if MMT is some sort of regime that you shift to. Well, ladies and gentlemen, MMT, and I apologise if you're paranoid, MMT is all around us. In our everyday life, we walk the streets and there it is. So you've got to be clear, it's not a regime, it's a lens, what I call a superior lens for understanding the operations of the monetary system, superior to the way in which the mainstream of my profession attempts to construct an understanding of the monetary system, full of myth. And it also allows us to cut through and identify what the actual capacities of the currency issuing government are. And I think this is an incredibly empowering lens because it cuts through what I call the veil of ideology. Because if everybody has an MMT understanding, that is that they actually understand the way our system out there operates and what our governments can and can't do and what the consequences of different actions will be, well, then they'll no longer tolerate a politician getting up there and saying, we've got to tolerate 10% unemployment because we'll run out of money. Or we can't deal with climate change because we haven't got enough money. Because if we all understand that that's not true, well, then that smokes them out, doesn't it? Because then the politician has to disclose why they want to have 10% unemployment. And I think that empowers our democracies. And the other thing we've then got to understand is that MMT is relatively agnostic. Well, it's not relative, it's agnostic about policy. And in a way, you know, it's neither right wing or left wing. To operationalise the understanding that MMT provides you, you've got to overlay that understanding with a set of values, with an ideology. And so a real hardcore right winger who understands MMT would come up with a different set of policy interventions to a left winger like me with the same monetary understanding. So it just happens that the MMT founders and the core group are relatively progressive. Just happens that. But that doesn't mean that MMT is left. My values are left, but my understanding of the monetary system isn't left. It's knowledge. That's a really important thing to differentiate in when you're talking to people, because there's all these, you know, the resistance that we're getting now, those quotes and that, is not about the core monetary theory that we've provided, because these characters don't even get it. It's about that they think it's left wing. So they're really having a debate about values, and they actually don't understand the distinction. But you all do. What having your currency, and this is just reinforcing what Warren said, what having your own currency means is that the currency issuer can buy whatever is available for sale in that currency, including all idle labour. Once you understand that, then you immediately know the next thing, and that is that any mass unemployment in the economy is a political choice of government. It's not something that's come out of the ether, it's not market driven, and none of all of that's true. It's not because people are lazy. It's because governments have chosen to run net spending positions, deficits, that are too low or surpluses that are too big. And so once you understand that, then the sort of questions you'll hassle your local politicians with will be different to the questions that you might ask if my profession gets up as they do and say, oh, well, you know, what students are taught is that unemployment is a voluntary optimising choice of people between leisure and earning income. That's what's taught to students. And the other important thing is that the fact that the government can buy whatever's available for sale doesn't mean that it should. It all depends. And if it does, then what MMT allows you to tease out is what the consequences of different positions using that capacity will be. We've got music. Briefly, having your own currency doesn't mean that the nation will be richer in material terms. So I often see on Twitter, oh, if we go to MMT, everybody will be better off. Well, not necessarily. A poor country that doesn't have... What MMT says is that the available real resources that you have in the nation, plus those that you can induce from others through trade, can always be fully used and made productive. But what level of output and services that emerge from that may not be deliver very high level standards of material living. Okay, job guarantee and UBI. Warren's already given an introduction. Where we start from is that a currency issuing government has two options in terms of establishing a framework to maintain price stability, that is a steady inflation rate. It can either use unemployment buffer stocks, which is the dominant approach these days, and technical, it's this NAIRU, don't worry about it. Or it can take an MMT path and use an employment buffer stock. Now, Warren mentioned wool. I haven't got time to go into how I came up with this idea that initially, but it related to a wool price stabilisation scheme that the Australian government ran in, where the government would buy and sell wool to stabilise prices so that farmers would have stable incomes in terms of fluctuations in the wool clip. And at the time I was studying agricultural economics, and that sounded like full employment of wool to me. And it was at the time in the late 70s when unemployment was emerging in Australia for the first time. And so I wasn't interested in wool so much other than to keep me warm in winter, but I was interested in the unemployment. And so in the same principle, when the private market's weak, the government can buy the labour, and when the private market becomes stronger again, it'll buy the labour back out again. That's an employment buffer stock. It goes up and down with the cycle. Now, the point is that unemployment buffer stocks is an incredibly costly way in which you can maintain price stability. Yes, it maintains low steady inflation rates typically because it disciplines workers from pushing up wages typically, and it creates poor sales conditions that firms can't push up margins. That's sort of the story. But it creates incredible income losses. It's the daily income losses are massive because these people aren't working and producing, but it also has incredibly costly social pathologies. Mental health, crime, substance abuse, family breakdowns, intergenerational disadvantage, go through them. I could list stacks. And the benefits of full employment, of course, are the opposite. It's like a mirror, that individuals now have income stability, they can manage their personal risk profiles. They feel better because if you're working, you've got social esteem and you feel as though you're included in society. You typically have pathways to higher skill development. We know that poverty can relieve unemployment. I've been involved in a scheme in South Africa, a public works scheme, which in the first 5 years employed 1 million people, and everybody in that program moved above the poverty line. It was just so obvious. This was a program that the IMF didn't like, obviously. And intergenerational stability is a really important one. If the only thing that happens from a job guarantee is that children grow up seeing their parents go to work each day and don't inherit the disadvantage of being in a jobless household, well then that would be sufficient to justify a job guarantee. All right, so I think Warren's done it, that it's an unconditional offer. You just float a job offer at a minimum wage that's socially inclusive. That doesn't mean a poverty wage. It means that the person who's receiving it can participate meaningfully in society. Go to the theatre, go out to dinner occasionally, go to football matches, whatever. It's not a pittance. It's not just a mere consumption wage. But that sets the minimum wage. And of course, how do you know when you've reached what we call loose full employment? Well, it's when nobody else walks through the door asking for a job. That's it. Why is it loose full employment? And Warren mentioned a sort of full employment. Well, it's loose full employment because it doesn't take care of what we call underemployment. So if I lost my job and we had a job guarantee, I'd be down the job guarantee office to get a job. But the reason that it might mismatch my skills is because it has to be inclusive to the most disadvantaged people. And we know that the disproportionate burden of unemployment falls on those who are low skilled and have difficulty anyway engaging in work. Okay, Warren's already mentioned that. The important point here is that the government, a lot of progressives think, well, when you've got unemployment, what the government should do is stimulate the private sector. Now, what they mean, you'll see schemes to have major infrastructure projects and things like that. Well, that's good, but it runs the danger because you're going to be competing for resources as the level of activity rises at market prices with private demanders for those resources, firms and that. You run the risk of triggering inflation. I call that a generalised Keynesian expansion, but that runs the risk of being inflationary. A job guarantee doesn't compete with any private sector bidders because it buys off the bottom. The unemployed, by definition, have zero bid in the private market because nobody wants them. So you can't be pushing up prices by bidding resources that currently have no bid. You're buying off the bottom. These micro benefits are just a reflection on what the benefits of full employment are. You reduce, Warren's already mentioned it, you reduce private sector hiring costs because people are already in the workforce. A lot of research studies show that when people become unemployed, over time their social network shrinks down to 1. They start to, the psychological processes start to impact upon their ability to manage time. That means that they sleep in and stuff like that. And why wouldn't you? And a whole lot of other things that make it difficult to transition back into the paid workforce. That's all gone. It reinforces intergenerational advantage. One of the significant findings in the social psychology and sociology literature is that children that grow up in jobless households, entrenched joblessness, inherit that disadvantage and become and suffer right through their adult lives. Training, spatial advantages. It means that little villages. I've just been up in St Anne's yesterday. That little village, if there was unemployed people there, they'd get jobs. It's not a cosmopolitan thing. It's not that. It can support, it can be an essential part of environmental sustainability because the sort of jobs that would be approved would have to be green, and so on. But don't get the idea that the job guarantee is the bee's knees, that it's the panacea for everything. It's just the first thing a currency issuing government should put in place. And there's a whole lot of other things, you know, public health, public education, Green New Deal, infrastructure, transport, all of that. That's on top of all of this, but this is just the basic thing. People say, well, what's the cost? Well, what does any public program cost? Not the numbers that are in the budget statements. They're meaningless in their own standalone. They don't mean anything. What a policy program costs is the real resources that are consumed by that program. So the extra food that the unemployed might be able to buy, that's a real cost. And so MMT has a different concept of cost. And so when I see politicians say, oh, well, you know, it's going to cost $13 billion, so what? What does that mean? Okay, there's all this stuff about are the jobs real? I mean, the easiest way I think about that is that how many of you have been asked when you go to the supermarket to pay, have you got a real job? I've never been asked that. I've never been asked that. So this idea of a real job is just another ideological way of avoiding governments taking responsibility. And, you know, my research centre has done very large-scale research in Australia of local government agencies, and we've identified hundreds of thousands jobs, which is more than the unemployed, that will meet community need, that will meet environmental care needs, that will never be delivered by our market process, that is a private profit process, which add net social benefits. That's a real job. We're so conditioned to think of productivity in terms of something that adds to private profit, whereas productivity, in the way I think about it, adds to social profit. So, you know, all this stuff. I also see that it's radical because at the moment our societies aren't conditioned to accept a state where people who could be productive will take free income from the state and not do anything. We're just not ready for that. And that's going to be my next slide. But what the job guarantee can do, because it's operating in the standard paid work paradigm, what it can do is start pushing the boundaries on what we consider to be productive work. And so I've advocated that musicians should be offered job guarantee. The greatest in Australia, the best income support for musicians is the dole, the unemployment benefit. And as a musician, I know that's worldwide. I know that. So I'd offer all my mates in bands who haven't got work other than playing a job. Now, what would they have to do in return other than go and play gigs? Well, they'd have to go to school. They'd have to go to schools and teach and do rehearsals in school halls and teach kids about how guitars work and how to compose music and how to get on with each other in bands and stuff. That's the big one. And, you know, I go surfing. I'd hire the surfers in the job guarantee. Now, what would they do other than surf? Well, one of the big problems in Australia is in summer people drown in the beaches because they don't understand water safety. So there's a huge role, because I jump in the most dangerous parts of the beach, because the rips take you out to the break. So they're ways, they're just examples that, you know, that I associate with. But I just walked up from somewhere here, and I've just saw thousands of jobs that are currently not being offered in Birmingham that could be offered, that would add to public value. And you could have many examples, but it's pushing the boundaries, that's the point. Okay, basic income, why not? the progressives have become obsessed with basic income. And I think I heard John McDonald the other day talking about basic income, for God's sake. And I've got a general rule: when the CEOs of companies who have some of the most pernicious labour relations, like Amazon, start advocating for something, I get suspicious. And why I'm opposed to basic income is because it surrenders to the neoliberal myth that the government can't do anything about unemployment. It gets the understanding of what causes unemployment completely wrong. And it's morphed over the history of the literature. It's lately about robots. But it gets what Warren told you at the outset, why unemployment occurs. Because the deficit's too low. That's it. And I'm against the UBI because it's an individualistic approach. It's a neoliberal approach. We used to be involved in collectives. We related to each other in collective terms. Now we're relating to individuals in individualistic terms as looking after themselves, and we're constructing these individuals who haven't got enough money as mere consumption units. Oh, they haven't got enough income, well, we better give them some so they can maintain a minimal amount of consumption. The CEOs want that so that people can still keep buying stuff. But that's not how we should construct individuals. Because if we offer an individual paid work, we're not only offering them an income, we're offering them inclusion in the mainstream society. We're offering them a chance to join social networks and meet their future partners and feel good about themselves as part of the values of society. That's why I hate UBI. And the other thing is that if you want to make the UBI sufficient to provide a good material standard of living, well, then you create inflation. There's no anchor. Whereas if you want to avoid the inflationary pressures from it, you've got to make it so pitifully low that it doesn't accomplish any poverty alleviation anyway. Okay, so last thing I want to talk about in this room is EU. Thank you. And we've been in Edinburgh and Glasgow the last 2 nights. Whatever. And you've got to appreciate it's in the middle of the night for me. And, the Scots are in a real bind because they now want their own currency, but they don't want to leave the EU. And the referendum results, the Remain was very strong in Scotland. But what they don't get is that the RUK, as we call it now up there, RUK, I love it, with a small r, the RUK is already declared, as you all probably know, that the continuing nation is going to be the RUK. If Scotland becomes independent, then the legal entity that's currently called the UK is going to persist without Scotland. Now, why does that matter? Well, that's because the UK doesn't want to surrender its position on the Security Council of the UN. Because if it agreed that there were 2 new nations, that's what would have to happen. Now, why does that matter for Scotland? I'll come back to Brexit in a sec. Why does that matter for Scotland? It means it's because it's now a new nation. And under EU rules, if it then seeks accession to the EU, it has to adopt the euro. So that's this pickle Scotland are in. Now, we've moved the debate in Scotland from Sterlinisation. They've now basically got over that nightmare. But now they've got to embrace the EU thing. But you've got to embrace it before that. And here's a perfect example of how we differentiate between MMT as a body of work and then put values on top of it. Because, in effect, MMT as a core body of principles is agnostic about membership of the EU. So on Twitter I see MMTers say, well, MMT says we've got to be out of the EU. Who says? Bill Mitchell says. Well, that's conflating my values with my understanding of the way the monetary system works. And as a progressive individual, I hope, on the left, the true left, not the left that shifted out Blairite to the right, where the centre seems to have gone that way. That's right, yeah. The EU is the last thing, the last configuration that a progressive left person would advocate joining or being part of or staying in. And the reason I say that is because it's the neoliberalism isn't just a political preference, it's been embedded into the core legal structure of the arrangement in the treaties, starting with the Single European Act and then going through to Maastricht and on. The neoliberalism is core to the EU. It's a neoliberal project. And I understand these left people have sort of, you know, the EU for them is some sort of security blanket, or some sort of expression of cosmopolitanism, you know, that grand tradition. Yet it's a really weird form of cosmopolitanism, because cosmopolitanism in the literature is, and the philosophical ideal is that everybody's in it. Well, the EU lets people die on beaches who try to get into the little cosy arrangement. So, you know, it's not an expression of cosmopolitanism at all. It's a perverted form of cosmopolitanism. And how can you assert your democratic independence when you're forced to accept laws that are created by technocrats in Brussels, that are adjudicated in disputes by not your highest court, but the European Court of Justice, and which force trade agreements on you, which allows corporations under investment dispute mechanisms to then, if they feel as though their profits are being threatened by legislation by any particular jurisdiction in the interests of the people of that jurisdiction, they can take you to court and win and overrule that legislation. Why would you want to be part of that? That's the end.
Hi, welcome back. So what did you think? Do you have any questions? Leave any comments or questions below and we'll get to them as soon as we can. A couple of things I really liked about this one. I love Warren Mosler and his Pompeii story, you know, because it really goes to show that the government that issues the currency, they set the terms. You know, even in our Constitution, it specifically says that the government has the right to regulate the economy. So a federal government with monetary sovereignty, they set the terms. They set the terms of exchange, they set the price, they set everything. And they could be laissez-faire about the whole thing, as I mentioned several weeks ago. You know, the analogy of the parents that don't do anything and they let the kids run rampant. You can do whatever you want to do as a federal government. You can be laissez-faire and let the market run roughshod over people, or you can be overbearing, you know, and not let them have any freedom or wiggle room whatsoever, or you could meet somewhere in the middle. But either way, the federal government has ultimate power. That is a scary thought. And the only thing that makes me feel better about that is when I remember that we are the government. It's not a separate entity. It doesn't have power over us that we don't acquiesce to allowing it to have. So if you want to be less scared about your government, get more involved in your government. Put down the TV remote from time to time and take notice of what's happening and get involved. You do that, and we can be safe in the knowledge that the federal government will work for us because we are the government, And why wouldn't you want to work for yourself? We'll be back next week with part 2.